Oh no.
Okay, it's recording. Okay. First question.
First question.
What is your full name and relationship to me, the interviewer?
My full name is Stephen, spelled with PH. Lee, named after Robert E. Lee, believe it or not.
Yeah, that's kind of bad.
I know. Bargdill, which is German for people of the Mountain Valley, Jr. And I hate my name on many different levels. So my full name is Stephen Lee Bargdill Jr. And you are my offspring. My biological offspring.
The mic's gonna pick up on that.
On what? Me throwing the thing for the
yeah.
cat? It's stuck.
Okay. How old are you, and what do you do or have done for a living?
I will be 50 on March 29th. I currently teach creative writing, poetry, nonfiction, and conspiracy theories at Great Bay Community College and University of New Hampshire. And I am part-time instructor because that's what higher education is going to. And I'm starting my real estate career. I'm getting into I'm like 4 months into my second year, something like that. And before that, I used to make pizzas.
So, you talked about a few things there. You brought up you teach conspiracy theories.
Yes.
So like, how does that work in the classroom?
Well, the class is technically the technical name for the class. The real name for the class is Society and Technological Change, which is a boring title. It's a boring title, and I want to rename it to Bigfoot, Tupperware, Aliens, and Outhouses, but they won't let me. I would get like full enrollment every semester if they let me rename it to that, but they won't. And the students that come out of the class, they're like, "Oh my God, we literally talk about Bigfoot, Tupperware, aliens, and outhouses, and also Facebook."
I've been in one of those classes before.
Yes, you have. Yeah.
Multiple times. They're very fun.
Yeah. Yeah. We also talk about the Catholic Church and buttered cathedrals and indulgences and how that whole thing was kind of, they try to break it down with poetry back in the day, but it didn't really take effect until a printing press was invented, and then the Catholic Church broke off with the Protestant Reformation through the proliferation of memes, because nobody could still read, but they could print cartoons. So
you brought up something about poetry. Just keep that in mind.
Okay.
The other stuff is really interesting. I'll interview you later about that. That seems interesting. But you also brought up pizza delivery.
Yes.
So why do you do pizza delivery before teaching?
So your mom and I were living on Clinton Street in Columbus, Ohio. We'd only been married a few months. We were poor, broke, and in love, and she worked at Victoria's Secrets as, I can't remember if she worked on the line where she was packaging things or if she worked as a person on the phones taking orders. Might have been both at one time or the other. I don't remember. And I was looking for a job, and I got hired by Domino's because that day you got the newspaper, you found that the jobs that people were hiring for, you sent in your application, and you got hired. I got hired in as an assistant manager, and I really enjoyed working with pizza. Like, I really enjoyed working with food and people and the service industry, and At one point, I thought about opening up my own pizza shop. I had all the equipment, a store location, seating for 150 people, a bar that sat like 75 people. And about 2, 3 weeks before open, the owner of the hotel, because I was located in a hotel, I had like catering contracts written up for like years out. Like I was set. Like I could see there was going to be money coming in, and um, the owner of the hotel called me. He says, "Yeah, I'm not paying the bank anymore, and I don't own the hotel anymore." And then the bank told me to get out. So that's when I decided to go back to school. And,
Huh.
yeah.
Interesting. I don't know how to segue to the next question. So, how would you define poetry? What is it, and how would you describe it?
Poetry is the controlled use of language to create art and meaning from two different points of view. One is from the author's point of view, and one is from the reader's point of view. There is not necessarily any wrong interpretation. It's a piece of literature that it's like when we read Shakespeare, like when we read his plays, right? That's written specifically. A lot of it is written specifically in iambic pentameter, and you have like Romeo and Juliet, for example. And I grew up in the '80s, and they showed this video that was really bad. There was some nudity in it, and I remember my teacher like hitting the button and fast forwarding through it, and then because it was a VCR, it's weird.
Old.
Yeah, it was old. And they were all in like medieval costumes and that kind of stuff. So the language is so beautiful that it sticks with us, and I've seen renditions of it where it's like gang fighting, which is totally different from what it was originally intended. I've seen renditions of Hamlet where when his father comes and shows up as the ghost, Hamlet is actually possessed. So there's a different interpretation to the words on the page from the reader, but it's a very controlled language. Even with free verse, which is not really all that free, it's very controlled and meticulated and examined down to where you even put punctuation. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
Because I've been told also that like poetry is like about rebellion or breaking all the rules, but there feels like there's a lot of rules to it.
It can be about breaking the rules, and it can be about rebellion. But you look at Robert Frost's Two Roads, Two Paths Divided. When you get to the end of the poem, you realize that either path is good as the other. Like it didn't matter which path he took, just that he took a path. Like that's the whole point of the poem, and nothing about that poem is about rebellion. On the other hand, you have a poem like Howl by Allen Ginsberg, which is like a 45 page diatribe of homosexuality and a cry against consumerism, American consumerism specifically. I mean, he looks at a hotel and he calls it Moloch, which, it's like a demon trying to suck the soul out of people because they're buying stuff all the time. So that one was definitely about, rebellion and breaking the rules. But then on the other hand, you have Robert Frost over here going, "Look, there's a snowy road in the forest." like it could be either. There's no.
What about rules for like language wise?
For language, so if you look at, there can be a lot of rules. but they're not really rules. They're more like patterns, right?
Yeah.
So you look at the Villanella. I always call it the vanilla poem because I can't pronounce Villanelle. I don't know. Dylan Thomas's "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night." That rests on repetition of lines and a certain number of syllables and specific number of lines in each verse, and it's got an A B C D A. Like it's a weird rhyme scheme, and I've written those before, and it's hard. It is so hard, but a lot of times when you're forcing a pattern, it ends up helping you invent new creations and new pieces of work. So forcing yourself to a pattern often unleashes your creativity.
Huh. Would you say that prose has more restrictions than poetry, or is it about the same, or are there no restrictions between them?
The problem with people writing prose is that they think that they do not have to look at the individual words and punctuation as closely as you would poetry. But I would say that in today's day and age, it's even all the more important. You use a lot of the poetical techniques in prose to hypnotize your readers, which is very, very, very sneaky way and can be at times unethical depending on your purposes. Like prose can be very powerful if the author looks at the construction of sentences and paragraphing in the same way that a poet would look at their creation.
So how would they be looking at their creation? Like, would they be like noticing those patterns and trying to fit into those patterns?
Well, for example, the to be verb, was, were, is, those words there, right? Those are weak words. One of the things I ask in my class is my beginning writing college composition is, what does the word is mean?
All I know is a verb or something.
Right.
Something.
What does the word was mean? What's the definition of was?
I don't know. I think of it more of something you use for a past tense. But that's about
Well, was is past tense. Is present tense. Were is past tense plural. Are is present tense plural, right? They're all the same verb. It's an irregular verb. And it doesn't mean anything. Technically, if you look it up in the dictionary, it'll say to be, right? It means to exist. But on the page, fundamentally, it does not do anything except connect the subject of the sentence with the predicate of the sentence. Now, the predicate is the verb plus everything else. The subject is the noun, right? If you go through your writing and just examine your to be verbs and work to remove them, your writing is going to be much, much more powerful, and people reading it won't know why. And it's because all of a sudden you're using action words. You're using action verbs that actually show movement. Like, so,
yeah. Connector words.
Instead of using connector words or words that are what's termed parts of speech.
Yeah.
Parts of speech are the words that we can't really define, but they're there to transition from one part of the sentence to the next.
Yeah.
So that's like one thing you could do, looking at your prose, and that's just a really simple thing. Another thing you could think of, I just read an essay the other day called If Mr. Clean Were My Father, which is a great nonfiction essay about this kid who goes to school and he's called into the principal office, and the principal is standing there with his mother, and his mother's like, okay, we're going to a different school, we're going to a different house, we're leaving your dad. And nobody knew about it, but his mom had planned it for years and years and years, right? The opening paragraph sentence is like 8 lines long. It's an 8-line long sentence with a lot of commas and em dashes, and you get kind of lost in it. It's just a really long sentence. It's by Dinty Moore as the author. It's just funny. He's not named after a soup, but you think he would be. And at the very end of that paragraph is a 3-word sentence. And so the difference between the really long sentence and the really short sentence gives the short sentence way more emphasis. At one point in the prose, he repeats the word nothing 3 times. But the third time, he screws you up. He just uses the word no. So on the page, it looks like you're going to see another nothing. Your brain is looking for that third repetition of the word nothing. And it's not there until you get to the next sentence, which is 1 word, which is nothing. And then all of a sudden the repetition of the same word becomes more and more powerful. And because you interrupted the pattern in the middle of it, you've really freaked out your audience, the reader, and they don't know that they've been freaked out. They don't know they're being played. Their emotions are being played, but they are. So that's the poetical technique, is the alliteration of the repetition and the interruption of a pattern and bringing it back. So you could totally use all that stuff in prose. But most readers don't look for that kind of stuff because they feel like poetry has to be special. And it's not. One of my favorite poems is titled "The Time I Asked the Kroger's Cashier to Scan the Old Tattoo of a Barcode on My Wrist." Like, that's the title of the poem. It's a great poem.
Who was it by?
I can't remember.
Well, we're kind of already talking about this, but what purpose does poetry play in your life or in, like, the world's life?
So, I think one of the things that's really frustrating for me is I teach this introduction in creative writing, and a third of the class has to be about poetry. And when I was first told about this class that I was going to teach it, I was like, oh my God, I don't want to read poetry. I don't want to read poetry. I don't like reading poetry. Because you think about the Shakespeare sonnets, and you think about Robert Frost, and you think about Dylan Thomas, which, by the way, let me tell you, not been dead that long ago. And then also, like, Auden is really great, right? So these are all these older poets, and they're dead, right? Like, that's not the moment we're living in. And so it's really hard to look at that poetry and go, oh, this is new and fresh. It's beautiful, but it's not new. We can examine it in fresh ways, kind of like taking that Romeo and Juliet and putting it in a gang fight as opposed to a family feud. But it's still the same thing. And poetry, modern poetry that's being written today, like one of my favorite poets is Limon. I can't remember her first name. It starts with an A. Is it Adrienne? Adrienne Limon. She writes a poem called "Run Like a Girl." Right? What do you think of when you hear the phrase "run like a girl"?
I just see someone like a girl that's like in like clothing for cross country, running really fast.
That's weird that you think of that. It's really weird because when most people hear the term "run like a girl," they think of someone just kind of flailing around, not really like kind of run, like they can't really run, right?
Yeah.
They're not good at sports or anything like that. And the title of the book, or the title of the poem, is "Run Like a Girl." And you read the poem, and it doesn't say anything about a girl. It says everything about a racehorse and its beating heart, and then you make the connection between this very strong, powerful animal and this idea of running like a girl. Like, it's powerful to be a girl. Another really one of my poems I love is Someday I'll Love Ocean Vuong, which is by Ocean Vuong. And it's all about his name. All the way through is about his name and who he is as a person, as an individual, in relation to his father, to his mother, and to his friends, and to his lovers. Like that, like... What was the question? Like, how does what is
poetry? What purpose does poetry play
poetry
in your life and in the world?
Poetry plays in the world a reflection of what's going on and how to move through the world in a spiritual way, and to pause and think about these moments and how words connect and how ideas connect to words as well. And it's almost like meditation. For the last several years, I've been working very slowly. Oh my God, very slowly. I'm in no hurry. Working on an anthology of poetry called Pickled Beans. Right? And like, why would you write a book of poetry titled Pickled Beans? And that's because my grandma Bargdill had a family recipe book that she published called Pickled Beans. We still have it. It's old. It's nasty. You would never ever make any of the recipes in there because they would all kill you. I don't know how they survived. Like, there's also recipes on how to make like homemade Windex in there. So it's like, right? And so I'm using that as kind of a vehicle to move into the poetry, and it's kind of really a reflection about not only who I am, but also how I'm connected to my family. And you know my family's history a little bit. You know how crazy weird it is. You know,
really weird.
Mom investigated by the FBI kind of thing, right?
I didn't know about that.
Oh, you didn't know? Okay, I thought you knew about that one. Okay. There's so many stories.
My LA teacher's gonna hear this.
It's
gonna
okay.
Be hilarious.
It's fine.
It's gonna be like, what is this?
But you know those stories. So taking that poetry, Pickled Beans, and just it takes a moment to just really kind of focus and think about who I am. But I think what happens is people confuse poetry that's being written today and view it as something hard that they have to figure out, like it's some kind of puzzle. And it's not a puzzle. It's just something. It's something you would admire and aspire to, but it's not a puzzle. I don't. That probably didn't answer any of your questions.
There's the reason why a lot of people today don't like poetry that's from the past, and the authors are all dead. And you mentioned that it's not fresh or whatever. Is that because the audience they're writing to doesn't exist anymore, or if it does, it's like there's such a low amount that most people just don't connect with it?
Well, I mean, in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, oh my God, like that is one of my favorite poems, and it was written about World War One, and I think, don't quote me on this. Obviously, you're recording it, so you are going to quote me on it. But I think the last person to survive World War One is dead. Like, I think that generation is pretty much like gone. But they haven't been gone that long.
Yeah.
Like, they've been gone like 2 weeks ago. Like 2 weeks, like, right? Few years. So, in your perspective, if you were to look at T.S. Eliot and read Wasteland, you'd be like, what the hell is going on? And one of the things he did was he stole stuff to put in his poems. He stole bar songs or bar shanties or songs that people would sing at the... So, they didn't have a lot of TV, and radio was kind of sketchy, but they did have like a lot of music and pianos and guitars. And so the thing is, they would go to a pub or a bar, they would get drunk, and they would sing. Yeah. And that would be the entertainment. And so a lot of those bar shanties, he stole a lot of lines from and stuck in his poetry. If you're not researching that and you read the poem, you don't know that. There's no way for you to know that, right?
Yeah.
Somebody that was reading it when it was first published, they'd be like, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that's a great song. I remember that song, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of the stuff that's being talked about is forgotten and or doesn't matter anymore. Um, so the poem, one of the I always forget its name. The poem that was critiquing the Catholic Church was. I don't know why I have a problem with this poem. I really, really don't. Because what happens is I will start talking about it,
Yeah.
and I can't remember its name, and literally 5 days later, I'll be like, oh, it's this. Piers Plowman, that's it. Hey, Piers
Yeah.
Plowman, that's the name of the poem. And it's about this guy named Piers. And he's a
Plowman.
plowman, yeah, and he has dreams about the Catholic Church and how it's corrupt. He was specifically talking about indulgences and Lent and being forced to not eat meat, and he was like in a landlocked area. He couldn't get fish easily like most of the Catholics could. Yeah, in the South could. Nobody cares.
Yeah.
Right? But the expose that was in Boston Globe about the sex scandal with the Catholic priests here in this local area, that was huge. Like, that was huge, right? That had a lot of weight to it because of the way it was published, the way the story was told. Like, the writing really carried that story and made it matter, because back in my day in the 80s, we all knew the priests were kind of involved in that kind of thing. But it wasn't being talked about in the way that the writing brought it out. Wasteland is about the tragedy of World War One and the wasteland that has left upon Europe, right? Piers Plowman was about the tragedy of the corruptness of the Catholic Church. You have poetry like Howl by Allen Ginsberg, which was rebellion against consumerism and this idea of controlling your emotions and not being allowed to be who you are. Those aren't really things we're dealing with anymore.
Yeah.
Right? When we get to Ocean Vuong's, someday I'll love Ocean Vuong. That's not about not being who you are. That's about self-love and accepting you who, as you, like, we live in a very, very lucky time, we're very lucky, but I can't imagine what that poetry is going to look like coming out of the Ukraine and Russian war. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Like, it's
about a war in a more modern time.
Yeah.
From nations that are they're relatively modernized or whatever, right?
They are.
Modern technology.
They're not relatively.
Well,
they are.
I don't know their situation there because
Yeah.
I've never been taught that in the American education system. And then there's also Russian soldiers that were lied to, that are forced into battle
Right.
to Ukraine, and then those people didn't want to fight.
Yeah. So what's that poetry going to look like, right? What is that moment of reflection going to look like? What was the question?
What purpose does poetry play in your mind?
Yeah.
Not in your mind, in your life and or the world's life.
Oh. I thought we'd moved on to a different question.
No, we've been on this question, but and also some follow ups, but whatever. You mentioned the Wasteland. The author stole song lyrics, right?
Yes. Yeah.
That reminded me. I remember you talking about how Shakespeare stole a bunch of his stuff or plagiarized.
Yeah.
That just reminds me. Can you tell me more about that?
So this guy North, I can't remember his first name, is the one that had pretty much all these original stories, or they're not original, but they were pretty good, and Shakespeare just took them and um, he just took them, and then the language he twisted so it's not so much that the stories. Okay, the stories that Shakespeare is telling are really good, but they're really North stories. But the reason why we read Shakespeare is because, and not North, is because Shakespeare was able to write an iambic pentameter and invent a good portion of the language that we use today. Like, even though English was being used, there are words and phrases that never existed before Shakespeare, which makes one of the reasons why it's so hard to read him, because sometimes you'll come across phrases that don't make any sense because they didn't make any sense back then.
Because you tried them out and they never caught on.
They never caught on, right? Yeah.
Okay. Can you name 5 poets? You've already done that.
I feel like I've already done that. Ada Liman, Ocean Vuong, Mary Oliver, Sam DeFlitch, who probably nobody knows. We've got a couple of her books there. She's guest lectured in some of my classes. She writes a lot about Philadelphia.
Oh yeah, that reminds me. You need to create a list of
yeah, that's right.
poets for my LA teacher.
Yeah, Ezra Pound. Let's see, who else do I have? Martinetti, who was an Italian futurist. Auden. Frost, Robert Frost. I wasn't expecting that question. Just don't ask me who my favorite poet is, because that would be even harder.
Who's your favorite poet?
Oh my god, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard because if you want to read poetry, you almost have to go out of your way to read it. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not something that's really pushed like it should be, I guess. Rape of the Lock was funny. That was a ballad about a guy who cuts the hair off of a girl he likes. He got paid a lot of money for that poem, actually. By the family of the people that didn't like Belinda, actually. They're like, hey, write a poem about Belinda, but make it funny and also embarrass her. So he was like, okay, we're going to just cut her hair off. But like, if you were to write a poem today called Rape of the Lock, you'd get in a lot of trouble because of the words that are used. Like, nobody wants to write a poem titled Rape, right?
Yeah. Unless it's probably about that, but then even then, you're probably gonna turn off, or probably gonna get people to turn away from that. I probably should have started with these 2 questions earlier. Or the first one of can you name 5 poets? The second one is can you name 1 poem?
I'm just not even going to answer that one. I just, like, I feel like, there we go.
Okay. Do you know any poetry by heart? If so, say it. If it's a long poem, just like say parts of it.
So much depends upon white chickens beside the red rain glazed wheelbarrow. I butchered that so bad. And I also like, I'm sorry about the plums. They were so good, so cold. Those are 2 different poems.
Yeah. We talked about the plums one.
Yeah.
in class the other day.
Yeah. The question, and I think I probably butchered that one too.
Yeah, whatever.
Yeah. I used to know more, but I don't know. I just don't really. I don't know. Like I was forced to memorize stuff in high school. Like I was forced to memorize the Raven. Um, I just can't anymore. And um, at one point, I knew the entire book of Matthew from the Bible from heart. I could just sit there and just like read through the whole dang thing without opening up the book or just I can't do that anymore. Um, and I've realized that the reason why I don't do that anymore is because I I don't I don't read it all the time.
Yeah.
I just don't read it all the time. I mean, I'm thinking about like the end of Wasteland, and the last lines of those poems are da di dum, da di dum, da di dum, which is the sound that thunder makes, but it's in Hindi, which is why it sounds weird. So, um, so there's parts of poems that I know, but I couldn't recite any like
By heart anymore.
yeah. I mean, I guess I could say that I know the fourth part um, of Hal, but that was added on years later because he was just bored. And the fourth part of Hal is basically holy, 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 and then it just keeps going like that for several pages to the point where you just don't. The word all of a sudden loses all sense of meaning. So.
So, okay. And now for general follow up, any take the direction of my own way, but I've been kind of doing that. So, what kind of poetry have you written?
So there's this poetry called blackout poetry, and it's where you take a text like a book or a newspaper or whatever, and you black out all the words except for the words you want.
Yeah.
And I've been kind of doing that a little bit with pickled beans, but that produces weird, very very weird recipe like poems. So I've kind of stopped doing that. I really like free verse because you take a lot of the old traditions and you still utilize them, but you utilize them in new and strange ways. Um, but I mean, that's a very personal project for me. It's not anything I'm planning on going out and trying to get published or anything like that. So, whereas the short story that I'm working on, while that's finished, I am trying to get published, and what's that one's called? Cutting lines.
I thought you also wrote Apostle Rose. I mean, I know you did, but I don't know if that's done or not.
It's finished. Yeah, it's probably gonna be. I don't know what I'm gonna do with that. That one's a hard story. So, but that's not really. Those aren't poetry. Those are short stories,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So.
Um, do you know like any recent poetry that you've written, or any old poetry that you've written?
Do I what?
Do you know of like any recent poetry you've written, or like really old ones, or like?
I've got some really really old poetry. I wrote I wrote a poem called White Bird, or was it White Birds, or was it Waiting in the Airport? Um, that was about just eating soybean burgers at McDonald's at an airport, waiting for a plane to come in. Like that was the whole thing. Um, I wrote a poem about a girl who leaves for the big city, and the father is really mad and pouts in the house, and then he realizes that she forgot a scarf or a coat. He runs after her, but by the time he gets there, she's gone. I don't remember the title of that one either. A lot of that stuff I have to pull up. That's some of the older poetry. And Pickled Beans, I don't really have titles for any of that stuff. It's just kind of working on it.
Yeah.
Kind of etched away. Sometimes, just cause.
Yeah. What would you give any advice to either aspiring poets or people that just don't like poetry, or based off the way it's been taught in school? Well, so we're talking about like kids around my age or maybe early 20s.
So for those that are trying to write it, they should go buy the book Mary Oliver's Handbook of Poetry. It's like under $10. You can also find it on Library Genesis for free, but that's pirating. But Mary Oliver's dead, so I'm sure she won't mind.
I mean, I love pirating.
Yeah, but I mean, that book I read every year. Sometimes I'll read it like 3 or 4 times a year.
Do we have it?
We do have a copy of it, and I've loaned it out to people before. But that gives you kind of an idea of how to work some of the language. And one of the things I like about Mary Oliver's approach is that she talks about it being a practice. So if you think about meditation as being a practice or art as being a practice, you don't necessarily have to make a living by doing a practice or a meditation practice, but you can live that way. You can live through that. And if you're young, you're 14 up into your 20s, don't worry about it being good. Just keep doing it. And ask people how you can improve it. Put yourself in situations where you're getting critiqued, so that way, even though you're not worried about whether the piece of writing is good or not, you're getting the help that you need to make it better. So that would be my advice on aspiring poets and writers. As for someone that doesn't like poetry, doesn't like to read poetry, I would really suggest to just go to a library or a reading. The University of New Hampshire is in your back door. Every month, once a month on Thursdays, I think it's the third Thursday normally, they have a professional author come in and give a talk, right? It's free to go to. It's either a nonfiction author, a fiction author, or a poet. And just go listen to them. And so many people say they don't like reading, and that's not true. They don't like what they're reading. And they don't like reading because they haven't found the thing that they like to read. So you have to explore. Like, your mom watches Call the Midwife.
Yeah.
I hate that show.
I also hate it.
I hate that show. She loves it. She just sit here and watch repeats of it all the time, right? Like, that's her thing. That's awesome. I don't mind the animated Star Trek series, and by the animated Star Trek series, I mean the one that was around in the 1970s. Oh. Not the newer ones. Those are all, I can't stand those.
Why?
Right? But the 1970s, I like it because it's campy, right? And they were running it and they were putting it together because they wanted the show to continue, and this was the only way that the show could continue. And they're really bad, and I like that, right? But I can't get your mom to watch it for nothing, right?
Yeah.
So and that's okay, right? It's just like TV. The difference is it's harder to figure out what you like reading. my best suggestion is to read with a pen in your hand and make sure that that is a conversation that you're having with the author. So you're writing and marking stuff down in the book, and you're saying, if you're not just underlining something, you're like, oh, I like it, so you underline it. No, you underline it and you say, I like this sentence because there's no to be verbs. It's very direct. I could see what's happening. It's short, it's tense, it's got drama in it. Explain why you like it. And then take a note of who that author is and go find out what else they've written, because maybe you'll like what else they've written. Maybe you won't, but it's a matter of exploration, not a matter of liking or not liking reading.
I think I'm gonna end it off here. Do you have any final words?
I don't.
Okay. Well, that's it. Bye.